Human Genome Project, which has been going for 16 years, and the human genome was set out in 2000, they'd found all the genes. Since then, they have been able to find genes which have a significant effect on physical traits, anatomical ones like height or eye colour. But where I'm starting from is something that I'm about to say, which is very hard to take on board. It is not my opinion, it is a fact. They have not been able to find significant heritabilities for psychological traits like intelligence, any mental illness, and personality traits. To explain the huge gulf that exists, well, not explained, but to characterize it, the gulf between twin study and adoption study heritabilities, which for something like intelligence, for example, are 50%, and the findings of the Human Genome Project, which are around about 1 to 5%. So they can find genetic variants, but they only account for a tiny amount of the variants. They use this phrase, the missing heritability, or they used to call it the DNA deficit. And indeed, the new story apparently is instead of calling it missing heritability, they now want to call it the hidden heritability. It's not my opinion, it's the person who I respect most in this field is a chap called Robert Plomin, who used to be at the Maudsley and is now at King's College, told The Guardian last week, I have been looking for these genes, ones that have a significant effect on psychological traits. I've been looking for these genes for 15 years. I don't have any. Having made that statement to you, I think it's always interesting to do this, is just to go quickly ask for a show of hands here. Let's say go for 50-50 or 60-40, something, or either way, 60-40, for the role of genes and overall, because obviously it's going to vary from trait to trait. I mean, there are some traits where they haven't found any heritability at all in twin studies. Put your hand up if you're what I'm calling a bit of both person. But nearly everyone. There'll be a tiny number of people who will say, yes, you're right, genes play very little role, and there'll be a small number of people who say it's very largely genes. One of my cleverest friends is a chap called Edward St Aubyn, who wrote some wonderful novels called the Melrose novels. I once sat Teddy down and said, okay, I'm going to explain the evidence to you. And he has always said, no, everybody's born with a bit of something in them, and that's a significant part of why we're like we are. And I explained all the evidence to him. It's 95 to 99% not genes, according to the evidence so far. And at the end of this half hour, I said to him, so, have I altered your opinion in any way? And he said, no, not at all. Let me just give you an example of what I'm talking about. They're now using enormous samples. They have very, very advanced technology and can look at all kinds of different kinds of genetic variants. In looking for what are called SNPs, which I won't even try and remember, single nucleotide polymorphisms, that's what they're called, which is was presented by Robert Plomin and many others as being the gold standard for genetic studies. They looked at the genes on hundreds of thousands of locations in all the likeliest places, since only about 2% of the genome is amino acids which code for proteins, which is the model that we were told is how genes work. Hundreds of thousands of locations. And on 37,000 schizophrenics. I mean, that is a shocking great sample. And compared what they found in the genes of the schizophrenics with 110,000 not schizophrenic people. They could find 108 variants which were commoner in the schizophrenics compared with the not schizophrenics. Some of those variants actually haven't been replicated, and yet, again and again and again, these studies get published in the press or on the Today programme. It turns out they're not replicated. Be that as it may, let's say all 108 variants were true. They explained only 3% of the variants. In other words, that study, which was hailed on the Today programme as a huge breakthrough, 97%, that study seemed to show, 97% taken at face value of the cause of schizophrenia is not genes. That would seem to be the implication of that study. We've been told all our adult lives that there's going to be genes for depression, the gay gene, for intelligence and so on. And of course, what they found, very early on was that they couldn't find any specific genes for anything at all, apart from in physical illnesses. They did find some, for example, breast cancer. But I mean, in the case of depression, for instance, they can't even find any variants. At least in schizophrenia, they found some variants which account for a tiny proportion the 108 variants account for a tiny 3% of schizophrenia. It's very hard to take what I'm saying on board, and obviously what you're going to be thinking, the next thing you're going to be thinking is, well, hang on a second, mate. You're grinding your axe here. Maybe I can accept. I mean, I can send you, any of you who are interested, the papers, very up-to-date papers, where it is still accepted that there is this missing heritability. You're bound to be thinking, well, surely, okay, that they've only had 16 years looking. Well, actually, that's quite a long time, and they've had huge budgets compared to what social science has. You're thinking, well, there must be, what about they're going to find something eventually, though, aren't they? Well, actually, no. I mean, if you talk to the molecular geneticists off the record, on the record, they will give a different story because they want to go on getting funded. But off the record, the story that they're now telling, which is the story that people like Marcel Manufo is telling, he claims they're going to find thousands of tiny variants which, when all added up together, will account for the missing heritability. The reason the molecular geneticists off the record say that's simply not true is because, for one thing, in order to do that, so tiny are the effects of the variants that they would have to have absolutely enormous samples. Samples so big that it's almost unimaginable that this data would ever be gathered. And I've had that conversation with a professor of genetics who has said this to me and said, I still believe that the genes are there, but I don't believe we'll ever find them, but for the simple reason that it's simply not feasible to do a study. At which point you're kind of getting into a Karl Popperian unfalsifiable belief rather than science. I would maintain the best analogy for the situation for the geneticists at the moment is that it's like that time when you leave your mobile phone in the office, but you're absolutely convinced you brought it home with you. And so you pat your coat, you look in your pocket, you get the house phone and ring it, and you're sure you left it on, but there's no reply. The rest of the family are drawn into the search. You start to look in more and more improbable places you've never been during the time since you got home. Now, some of the theories that, and it really is theories, that geneticists are beginning to demand research money, and lots of it, to research, are not far off the person who's lost his mobile phone saying, well, I've always had my doubts about ghosts. But, you've got to keep an open mind, and it's perfectly possible perhaps there is such a thing as a ghost. Who knows? Perhaps a ghost has borrowed it and it'll turn up. It's pretty much at that level when they start talking about junk genes, that the high proportion of the human genome is so-called junk. Yet junk genes cannot code for amino acids which code for proteins, so therefore cannot directly be causing particular states in the body. They can only be doing it very indirectly through junk genes switching protein coding genes on and off. And they haven't really found anything very significant there. The one area that I think remains genuinely up for grabs and it is what are called candidate genes. There's one in particular which got everyone very, very excited when it was first published, the paper on what's called the serotonin transporter gene, where if you had certain variants of it, and if you were abused, you were much more likely, if you were maltreated in childhood, you were much more likely in later life to become depressed, smoke dope, and various other unfortunate outcomes. When that study was first published, people were very excited by it, and lots of other studies have been done since. And what do they find? Well, they find frequently they don't replicate. However, there are plenty that do replicate, and so it's not cut and dried. On the so-called warrior gene, it's pretty much not in play anymore. So the MAORI gene, they have not had any joy really with the replication, or not enough joy. If you look at the meta-analyses of that, the MAORI gene, there was a huge meta-analysis done recently which really does draw a blank. None of what I've said so far, I'm talking always here about the direct effect of variants in DNA causing trait outcomes. There are other studies which have been able to find some heritability, but they're not able to identify specific genes which have specific outcomes. There's something called genome-wide complex trait analysis, which is essentially a sort of very dodgy mathematical thing, which has recently been exposed as dodgy by a paper by someone called Kumar. And that did find 23% for schizophrenia and various other things. But the problem with it is it's just sort of like tea leaves. It's basically like looking at tea leaves. They just use mathematics to see if there are any differences in the sort of patterns between a group of schizophrenics and a group of not schizophrenics. And those studies are not cited by scientists very often in support of anything to do with heritability, because they're not able to find specific genetic variants which have specific outcomes. There is, of course, epigenetics, which many of you will have heard of and get excited about. Now, epigenetics is more a hypothesis, I would say, at this point in terms of the science. A lot of it's based on animal studies. There are, of course, some human studies. But it's a bit of a misnomer. It's not really relevant to the question of why children are like their parents in terms of geneticism, because what we're talking about here is environmental effects on chemicals in the body, particularly methyl, although that's actually turning out to be very debatable, but whether it's methyl or something else, it's still there as a hypothesis, that there are chemicals that can be affected by, for example, if you're maltreated in childhood, that can then lead you to switch certain genes on or others off. That's very much, remember, just a mechanism by which the environment affects outcomes. Suspend your disbelief for a moment and imagine then that I'm right, and that when they've looked everywhere and they still haven't found anything of any significance, it's still 95 to 99% not genes. Well, what's going on? I mean, how can that be? Because it is the case that physical traits are affected by genes, much less than was expected, but still they are. For one thing, I would say a very simple point is that actually it makes an awful lot of sense in evolutionary terms for us to have been born very plastic, because each family requires of each of us a different strategy for attracting the resources of parents. And so in evolutionary terms, to be born plastic in terms of your psychology makes an awful lot of sense. For example, let's say your mother was very shy and she wanted an outgoing child, and you were born genetically shy. It would be much harder for you to attract her resources by being outgoing. If you've got a gene that's just saying be shy, be shy. It actually doesn't make an awful lot of sense for us to be born, with an exceptional intelligence to parents who couldn't care less about that. It makes much more sense to be able to suck up to your parents by adapting who you are to whatever's needed. And I'll come back to that in a moment. I've no doubt in my mind that there is physical transmission of psychological traits from parents to children. A properly scientific view of all this would be to say, well, okay, maybe it's not genes, but maybe that doesn't mean it's all nurture. In the case of autism, for example, I have no doubt in my mind that there are children who are born with a brain abnormality that means they have the problems that autistic children have. It hasn't completely been proven conclusively that that's true, but I suspect it will be. Why they've been born like that is up for grabs. It could have to do with what happens during the pregnancy. We know, for example, with ADHD, that if a mother is stressed in the last trimester of pregnancy, that her child is at greater risk of ADHD. Same with if the baby is born preterm and low weight. And quite exactly how that mechanism works is debatable. It could be that the child's born difficult, so the mother doesn't tune into it, so they get off on the wrong foot, so that results in ADHD. Could be that it's a physical thing. It's that the child, in the case of the last trimester, for example, there's no doubt that the high cortisol fight-flight hormone that's secreted in response to threat. The high cortisol in the mother in the last trimester gets passed through the placenta into the fetus. The baby's born wired and is much more likely subsequently to be conduct disordered or ADHD. If you come to the evidence on nurture, all I can say to you is that during the 15 years that the human genome has been chundering along, it has been shown many, many times over that nurture is definitely very important. In the case of schizophrenia, for example, the more kinds of maltreatment you've suffered and the more severe the maltreatment, the greater the likelihood of schizophrenia. It's a major cause of schizophrenia, maltreatment. Somebody who has had 5 or more kinds of maltreatment is 193 times more likely to be schizophrenic than someone who suffered no maltreatment. The best prospective longitudinal study, that started at birth and moved forward to 18, found that 9 out of 10 of the children who'd been maltreated ended up with a mental illness at 18. This idea of resilience, I think, is going to turn out to be utter balls. I don't think it's going to be shown that there are children who you can just mess with badly in their childhood and they turn out fine. I think that's a myth that was made up by the geneticists to kind of, this idea that you can have brilliant people walking out of sink estates with IQs of 160 coming from absolutely nowhere. Not any examples that I've ever heard of. And prodigy, likewise, all prodigies, as far as I know, every recorded case of a prodigy, they have been hothoused. So whether it comes to abilities or an awful lot of underperformance in academically and in careers is actually to do with your childhood having set your electrochemical thermostat, as I would call it, at a baseline level. The thermostatic setting is one where you're too anxious, too insecure, perhaps too lacking in self-confidence to be able to really deliver what you would like to be able to do. The implications of all this are absolutely huge. Imagine for a moment that I'm right. Whilst it by no means necessarily means that we can all just be anything we want to be, it does mean that there is much greater hope for the whole changing of society, being able to change through therapy. There is very good evidence that children who believe that their abilities are fixed at maths, if they're just given 4 lessons in the idea that their abilities are not fixed, the more that they believe that they were fixed before they started these lessons, the greater their improvement in maths 2 years later. But overall, they all improved in maths compared to control groups. That was a large study. Equally, for the mentally ill, believing you're mentally ill, whether it's you or your family or the professionals caring for you, if they believe that it's a fixed mental illness, if they buy into the story that ghastly program a couple of weeks ago with Stephen Fry being told by a psychiatrist that he had an incurable illness for which there was only one solution, drugs, the drugs which were actually going to shorten his life, that is a disgrace. It should not be going on. There are much better alternatives to that, and it's very unhelpful to Stephen to tell him that. Paula Yates, who I worked with, is somebody I know believed that she had inherited genes which meant she was doomed. And in fact, of course, it turned out that her biological father, she thought she'd got this from her father, Jess Yates. And it turned out that, in fact, her actual birth father was Huey Green, not Jess Yates at all. But her belief in the idea that she'd inherited these genes, I know, because she told me, had a big effect on how she saw herself. I've actually written a book about David Bowie, which is all about how he slayed his childhood demons and he had 3 mentally ill aunts on his mother's side and a half-brother who became very ill. Bowie managed to overcome the belief that there was bad seed in the family, what his grandmother called the curse of this family, through his music and through various personae. But that's a whole other story. I think the biggest implication I would put to you of all that I've said is that what is passed down the generations is intergenerational patterns of nurture, patterns of very positive ones like humour. There are all sorts of things in my own family I can think of which I think of very fondly, and there are some things that I think of less fondly. All of us are in that position. And these things are passed down through patterns of nurture. We suffer from offspring Stockholm syndrome. It's very hard for us to, we're like captives in a siege, if you like, during our childhood with being kidnapped by our parents, and we do our best to try and suck up to them. And that's ultimately my argument as to how we become like them. It's through identification, modelling, but also through maltreatment. If you swapped me with my 3 sisters at conception, I believe one of them would be sitting here now, not me. I was treated completely differently by my father purely because of what was between my legs when I was born. it will be true of all of you. The fact that you were born first, second, boy, girl, your parents' marriage was at this stage when one was born, at that stage, at another stage. We can change all this stuff. That's what I'm saying, is that you as an individual certainly can change. Therapy can work. CBT, not CPT, please, but stuff that goes into your childhood, stuff that gives you a very solid relationship with somebody who's really batting for you, gives you a different relationship platform from which to go forth into the world. We can change our society. My God, I become speechless when I look at the society we're in today. Politicians play on our desire to improve our material circumstances in order to provide a more affluent life for our children. But if only we could see that once a basic level of material security has been achieved, it's far more important to pass love down the generations than property or stocks and shares.